Reports emerging from across Russia suggest a situation that few expected in a country long defined by its energy wealth. Citizens are protesting over shortages of gasoline. In towns and regions far from the capital, videos and witness accounts describe long lines at fuel stations, restrictions on purchases, and prices that climb week by week. Local frustration, usually expressed in private, is beginning to spill into public spaces, with demonstrations and gatherings that authorities attempt to dismiss as minor disruptions. Yet analysts warn that these scenes mark a significant moment. For decades, fuel abundance has been a symbol of Russia's strength. The very idea that people would take to the streets over gasoline shortages underscores the depth of strain created by war, sanctions, and the reallocation of resources. Observers note that the protests are not coordinated on a national scale, but their spread across multiple regions gives them symbolic weight. In agricultural areas, farmers complain that they cannot secure enough diesel to operate machinery during critical harvest periods. In industrial towns, truck drivers and small business owners voice anger at rising prices that erode their livelihoods. Even in urban centers, ordinary commuters express frustration at paying more for each liter, while being told that Russia remains one of the world's largest oil producers. This disconnect between the narrative of abundance and the reality of scarcity is driving anger that cuts across social groups. Local reports suggest that officials have attempted to manage the situation quietly. Fuel is redirected to regions with the loudest complaints, and temporary subsidies are introduced to calm discontent. But these measures are piecemeal, and the perception is that they address symptoms rather than causes. The causes themselves are clear to many analysts: a system strained by war priorities, with resources diverted to military needs, exports redirected to sustain revenue, and domestic distribution networks struggling under pressure. The result is that ordinary people, long assured of stability in this most basic of commodities, now face uncertainty at the pump. For the Kremlin, the protests are a delicate issue. Acknowledging them risks amplifying their significance, while ignoring them risks fueling anger. Official media focuses on images of resilience and insists that shortages are temporary, caused by seasonal demand or logistical adjustments. Yet the narrative is undermined by the lived experience of citizens who wait in lines and pay higher prices regardless of what they are told. Analysts stress that in authoritarian systems, the perception of incompetence in providing essential goods is particularly dangerous. Bread, medicine, and fuel carry political weight far beyond their economic value. International observers view the protests as an early warning sign. While small in scale compared to historic uprisings, they reveal that the war's costs are no longer confined to budgets, elites, or distant battlefields. They are manifesting in the daily lives of citizens in ways that propaganda cannot disguise. This shift carries profound implications. Wars are sustainable as long as the population feels shielded from their direct consequences. When shortages and inflation enter daily routines, patience begins to erode. For our readers at Times Finances, it is essential to track these developments not only as social unrest, but as signals of broader economic fragility. Gasoline is not merely a commodity, it is a measure of trust between state and society. The protests over fuel demonstrate that this trust is under strain and that the consequences of war are reaching deeper into Russian life. We will continue to analyze these shifts with clarity and depth, and we encourage you to subscribe and stay with us, because what may seem like scattered demonstrations today could evolve into pressures that reshape both politics and markets tomorrow. The effects of Russia's gasoline shortages are becoming increasingly visible across sectors of the economy. While the protests themselves are modest in size, the underlying frustrations reflect problems that touch almost every aspect of daily life. Analysts emphasize that fuel is not just another commodity, it is the foundation upon which transportation, agriculture, manufacturing, and distribution rely. When gasoline becomes scarce or expensive, the ripple effects spread quickly, multiplying pressures across an already strained wartime economy. In the agricultural regions of southern Russia, the crisis is particularly acute. Farmers, who depend on diesel to operate tractors, harvesters, and irrigation systems, face rising costs that directly cut into yields. Reports describe instances where machinery remains idle because fuel deliveries are delayed or rationed. This is not merely an inconvenience, it threatens the timing of planting and harvesting, with consequences that cascade into food production and pricing. Economists warn that food inflation, already a concern due to sanctions and supply disruptions, may accelerate as fuel shortages undermine efficiency in agriculture. The trucking industry faces a similar challenge. Drivers report paying more for each liter, while also dealing with long waits at fuel stations. Small trucking companies, which form the backbone of domestic logistics, are under intense pressure. Some have reduced routes, others have raised fees, and many are quietly considering layoffs. When trucks cannot move efficiently, supply chains slow down, raising costs for goods across the country. This is why protests have included not only frustrated citizens, but also truck drivers who view the shortages as a direct threat to their survival. In industrial towns, where factories depend on regular deliveries of raw materials and shipments of finished goods, fuel scarcity adds another layer of inefficiency. Managers complain that delays in transportation disrupt production schedules, forcing costly adjustments. While larger companies may have reserves or connections to secure supplies, smaller firms are more vulnerable. The unevenness of access to fuel deepens social and economic divides. Some regions cope better, while others face near paralysis. For ordinary citizens, the shortages manifest in familiar but frustrating ways. Commuters in regional towns face higher costs for public transport, as bus operators raise fares to cover fuel expenses. Taxi services introduce surcharges, and drivers sometimes refuse longer trips to save fuel. Families traveling between cities describe uncertainty about whether they can refuel along the route, an anxiety rarely experienced in Russia before. In daily routines, school runs, grocery shopping, visiting relatives, the absence of reliable fuel access is felt as a constant inconvenience and as a reminder of deeper instability. Local officials attempt to diffuse tensions with short-term measures, prioritizing deliveries to certain regions, imposing purchase limits to prevent hoarding, or offering subsidies to critical industries. Yet these solutions often backfire. Purchase limits anger citizens who see them as proof of scarcity, while subsidies create resentment among those excluded from support. The perception grows that the state is managing a crisis reactively, not preventing it proactively. This perception feeds into the protests, where slogans often highlight not only the lack of fuel, but also frustration with government responses. Economists describe this situation as a double crisis. Shortages reduce efficiency, while inflation reduces purchasing power. Households spend more on fuel and food, leaving less for other goods. Businesses pay more for transport and raw materials, reducing competitiveness. The war effort absorbs resources that could alleviate these pressures, meaning that the crisis is unlikely to resolve quickly. For many Russians, the gasoline shortage has become the most tangible evidence that the war has direct consequences for their lives. International analysts note that these domestic disruptions weaken Moscow's long-term resilience. A government can manage dissent through repression, but it cannot easily manage the economic distortions caused by shortages. Even if protests remain small, the cumulative frustration erodes trust in institutions. Citizens may not expect prosperity during war, but they do expect reliability in essentials. When that reliability is absent, loyalty becomes harder to sustain. For Russia's leadership, the protests over gasoline shortages present a dilemma that cannot be easily resolved. On the one hand, the gatherings are small and localized, not yet posing a direct challenge to the state. On the other, their symbolism is powerful. Demonstrations over fuel are not about ideology or abstract political debates. They are about access to a resource that underpins daily life. This makes them harder to dismiss and potentially more dangerous because they resonate across social and economic divides. From farmers to truck drivers to ordinary families, the grievances are widely shared. And that universality gives the protests a weight that officials cannot ignore. The Kremlin's response so far has been cautious. State media minimizes the scale of the protests, portraying them as isolated disruptions amplified by social networks. Official statements emphasize logistical adjustments and seasonal fluctuations, framing the shortages as temporary. Yet behind closed doors, insiders acknowledge that the government views the unrest with concern. They understand that protests sparked by tangible shortages carry more legitimacy in the eyes of citizens than demonstrations over abstract political ideals. When people take to the streets because they cannot afford fuel or find it at the pump, their frustrations are difficult to discredit. Authorities have employed familiar tools to contain the situation. In some regions, law enforcement has dispersed gatherings, issuing warnings or detaining organizers. In others, officials have sought to co-opt the protests by promising quick solutions, such as prioritizing deliveries or introducing subsidies. Yet these measures are reactive, not preventative. Analysts note that such a strategy may calm tensions temporarily, but it fails to address the systemic causes of the crisis. The risk is that protests will reappear whenever shortages intensify, creating a recurring cycle of discontent. Political analysts describe the protests as a test of the social contract between the Russian state and its citizens. For years, the implicit agreement has been that citizens accept restrictions on political freedoms in exchange for stability and access to essential goods. Fuel, as one of those essentials, is central to this bargain. If the state fails to deliver it consistently, the legitimacy of the bargain itself comes into question. This does not mean that citizens will suddenly mobilize en masse, but it does mean that quiet loyalty may erode into quiet disillusionment. That erosion, while invisible at first, weakens the foundation of authority. Within elite circles, the unrest has sparked unease. Business leaders worry about the economic costs of instability, while regional officials fear being blamed for problems beyond their control. Some insiders note that local leaders, caught between federal demands and regional frustrations, are particularly vulnerable. They must project confidence to Moscow, while also maintaining credibility with their constituents. As shortages persist, balancing these pressures becomes increasingly difficult. This strain exposes the fragility of governance structures that rely on loyalty rather than autonomy. International observers emphasize that while the protests may not threaten the government immediately, their symbolic impact is significant. They demonstrate that the war is not only reshaping Russia's relations with the outside world, but also its internal stability. Citizens who once believed that the war would not touch their daily lives are now confronted with evidence to the contrary. This realization, analysts argue, may not lead to mass demonstrations, but it will alter perceptions of the state's competence. In conflicts where legitimacy is as important as military strength, that alteration matters. For our readers at Times Finances, these developments are crucial to follow. They reveal how economic strain translates into political vulnerability and how seemingly local protests can illuminate systemic challenges. Understanding these dynamics is essential for anticipating the future of Russia's domestic politics and its ability to sustain the current trajectory. We encourage you to subscribe and stay with us because the story of fuel protests in Russia is not only about shortages, it is about the fragility of a system under pressure and the ways in which that fragility could shape the months ahead. Looking forward, the central question is whether the state can find lasting solutions or whether it will continue to rely on short-term fixes. If shortages persist, protests will likely recur, testing both public patience and government authority. If they fade, it will likely be temporary, with the underlying issues resurfacing when conditions worsen. Either way, the crisis has already shifted perceptions, and once perceptions change, returning to the old sense of stability is difficult. Abroad, the reports of fuel shortages and localized protests in Russia have been received with both interest and caution. For international observers, the sight of demonstrations over gasoline in a country so closely associated with energy abundance is striking. It challenges one of the central assumptions that has shaped global perceptions of Russia for decades, that no matter the geopolitical tensions, Moscow would always guarantee stability in its domestic energy market. Now, that assumption is being questioned, and the implications extend beyond Russia's borders. Western media has been quick to highlight the paradox. Commentators in Europe and North America point out the irony of one of the world's largest oil producers facing shortages at home severe enough to provoke street protests. Analysts frame this as evidence of systemic strain caused by the war. Sanctions that limit technology imports, export redirection that drains domestic supply, and logistical networks struggling to cope with shifting priorities. While some coverage focuses on the human side, images of drivers waiting in queues or interviews with frustrated farmers, others emphasize the broader economic and political meaning. For Western audiences, the protests reinforce the narrative that Moscow's resilience is not limitless, and that the war is exerting pressure in ways that cannot be hidden. In global markets, the reaction has been more measured, but no less attentive. Traders recognize that disruptions inside Russia, even if localized, can signal instability with international consequences. The mere perception that Russia's energy system is under strain influences pricing, as investors factor in the possibility of reduced exports or policy shifts, such as rationing or export bans. The volatility in fuel futures reflects this uncertainty. Even small-scale protests inside Russia ripple outward into the financial world, where perception is often as powerful as reality. Diplomatic circles in Europe and Asia are also watching closely. In Brussels, officials interpret the protests as further justification for reducing reliance on Russian energy, emphasizing the importance of diversification. In Washington, policymakers see the unrest as validation of sanctions, suggesting that pressure is gradually reaching the domestic level. Yet in Beijing and New Delhi, the calculus is more complex. Both capitals benefit from discounted Russian oil, but both also depend on stability. If Russia cannot guarantee order in its domestic fuel market, questions arise about the long-term reliability of supply. These questions may not yet alter policies, but they inform quiet debates about risk and dependence. For Russia's allies, the protests are a double-edged signal. On the one hand, they highlight the vulnerabilities of a partner under strain, creating opportunities to extract concessions in trade negotiations. On the other, they raise concerns about unpredictability. Countries that rely on Moscow for energy or political partnership must weigh the benefits of cooperation against the risks of instability. Even among friendly states, the perception of a fragile Russia complicates strategic planning. International think tanks and consultancies have begun publishing analyses that treat the protests as early indicators of potential systemic weakness. These reports emphasize that while the demonstrations are small, their symbolism is outsized. They are not about opposition activists or political movements, but about ordinary citizens responding to material shortages. This distinction is critical for analysts, who view such protests as harder for the government to dismiss and more representative of widespread frustration. In their assessments, the fuel protests may foreshadow larger challenges if other essential goods become unstable. For investors and policymakers worldwide, the message is clear. Russia's domestic situation is becoming less predictable. Even if protests remain limited, they illustrate how war and sanctions are reshaping the country in ways that reach beyond the battlefield. They reveal a society under strain, an economy under pressure, and a leadership forced to manage crises on multiple fronts simultaneously. The global significance of these developments lies not only in the immediate risk of disruption, but in the longer-term shift in perception. Russia's credibility as a stable supplier and a resilient state has been damaged. Restoring that credibility will require more than official statements. It will require sustained stability, something increasingly difficult to guarantee under current conditions. The protests over gasoline in Russia may remain modest in scale, but their significance extends far beyond the size of the crowds. They represent a moment when ordinary citizens, typically cautious in their expressions of discontent, have chosen to step into the public space to voice frustration over an issue too tangible to ignore. This transformation, from private complaint to public demonstration, is important in any society, but in Russia it carries particular weight. It signals that the quiet patience of citizens is not limitless, and that even in an environment of strong state control, daily hardships can push people to act. For the Kremlin, the challenge is not simply managing shortages, but managing expectations. Citizens are being asked to accept sacrifices in the name of war, but they also expect that essential goods will remain available. Gasoline is not a luxury, it is a necessity, woven into transportation, agriculture, industry, and the routines of daily life. When this necessity becomes scarce or unaffordable, the implicit contract between state and society weakens. Analysts emphasize that it is this weakening, rather than the protests themselves, that may have the most profound consequences over time. Officials continue to insist that the shortages are temporary, and that measures are in place to stabilize the situation. Yet economists caution that the underlying pressures, sanctions, logistical bottlenecks, and the diversion of resources to the military remain unresolved. Temporary subsidies and regional deliveries may calm frustration for a time, but they do not restore confidence in the system's capacity to provide. Each new round of protests, however small, reinforces the perception that the state is reactive rather than proactive, struggling to manage rather than confidently leading. Internationally, the protests serve as a reminder that the costs of war are not abstract. They filter down into households, businesses, and communities, creating pressures that cannot be dismissed as propaganda. Global markets interpret these pressures as signs of fragility, adding risk premiums to Russian energy and reinforcing the perception that Moscow's resilience has limits. For allies and adversaries alike, the message is that Russia's internal stability is not guaranteed, and that the war is reshaping the country in ways that are increasingly visible. For Russia's elites, the situation introduces a quiet but growing unease. Business leaders, regional officials, and bureaucrats all recognize that protests over essentials like fuel are harder to suppress than political demonstrations. They reflect widespread needs rather than isolated ideology. Even if the protests fade, the knowledge that such discontent exists and can resurface alters the calculations of those in power. Analysts suggest that the protests may not topple the system, but they plant seeds of doubt that weaken loyalty over time. For our audience at Times Finances, these developments underline the importance of close analysis. What may appear as scattered demonstrations are in fact indicators of systemic stress, economic strain that fuels social unrest, political responses that reveal fragility, and global repercussions that reshape perceptions of Russia's stability. We will continue to monitor this story as it unfolds, and we encourage you to subscribe and stay with us, because the next wave of protests, whether tomorrow or months from now, may carry consequences that extend far beyond the streets where they begin. In the end, the protests over gasoline shortages highlight a contradiction at the heart of modern Russia. A nation that prides itself on being an energy superpower now faces demonstrations over fuel access. A government that promises stability now struggles to provide one of the most basic guarantees. And a society long accustomed to endurance is showing signs that its patience has limits. These contradictions are not easily resolved. They represent the pressures of war, the consequences of isolation, and the fragility of systems built on assumptions of permanence. Whether the protests fade into memory or grow into something larger remains uncertain, but the fact that they have emerged at all is a signal that cannot be ignored. In a country where silence has long been the norm, the sound of voices raised over gasoline carries meaning far beyond the fuel pumps. It is a reminder that even in the most controlled environments, necessity has a way of breaking through.